Hi, everybody. I am so glad to have you join us today for such an important update. It was almost exactly a year ago to the day that I had a conversation with our next guest from Ukraine. It feels almost like a completely different world looking back on early March of 2022. And so, what we're going to do today is catch up, find out how life has been and what to watch for next. Our guest carries many different titles, and we're going to talk a little bit about her life throughout these titles. Ina Sovsun is a mother, Fulbright scholar, professor, parliamentarian. She's a member of the Ukrainian government, and she's a proud Ukrainian as well. And Ina, the last time we were speaking, it was just a few days into the Russian invasion into Ukraine. You were at a friend's house that you were sharing with some former students as well. Your son had been sent to Western Ukraine, and it had been days since you had seen him, and you weren't sure when you were going to see him again. So there's a lot of ground to cover in the last year. But let's just start with the basics. Where are you now, and what is life like?
Well, I'm at my home, so that's already a good development. I've actually managed to get back home by end of March. That is when I started moving back in. I also would be spending sometimes a few weeks over the spring last year with my son in the west of Ukraine. But yes, it's been over the last 10 months, more or less, I've been able to stay at my home, particularly, of course, after Kiev region has been liberated. So that has been a good development for me. But then over the summer, in July, I guess, my son Martin got back from Western Ukraine. He moved back to Kiev first, well, to Kiev region first, to my parents over the summer, and then he got back to Kiev. So he's with me now. So that is a huge relief for me.
I'm sure for any mother, absolutely, to be back home and to have your child with you. Do you feel safe? Do you feel safe in Kiev?
Well, that depends. I think so. There are two kind of dimensions to talk about. First is safety, and that, of course, is you cannot feel safe as long as you have air raid alerts almost every day. Like we didn't have any today, but yesterday we had to them 3 times. They were short, about 30 minutes. People typically already don't react to them as much as it was the case a year ago, but it's still unpleasant, definitely. But it's also very disturbing for my kid's life because when he's at school and there is an air raid alert, they have to go to the bomb shelter every time. So you can understand how that is interrupting the educational process. And me being an educator myself, I'm of course deeply concerned about that. So that is, that is, well, first of all, it just not feeling safe, but second, it's also, it has this other kind of ramifications, like it interrupts your life cycle and your daily activities a lot. But there is another dimension, is the comfort of living in the city. And the truth is that, particularly over the winter time, Kiev has been at times very difficult to live in because of the attacks on energy infrastructure. We would have days when we would, I think that the biggest amount of time that we didn't have any electricity at my place was 3.5 days. And I live on the 14th floor. So when there is no electricity, my elevator doesn't work. So I have to climb up the stairs. I have electric stove. I have electric heating. And also the water wouldn't function. So we didn't have water that day, 3 days in a row. So that was most intense. But that was not typical. But what was typical is what we call the regular blackouts, the regular period of times when we didn't have the power, and that could have been like 4 hours. Then you have electricity 3 hours, and then you don't have it for 4 more hours. So that was over the winter. That was very, again, disrupting, but also it just was very difficult to organize your life in that way. But it is better now. We didn't have any blackouts for 24 days now, so it's definitely much better now.
And it's cold in the winter. We need to mention the element of weather in the middle of all of that, let alone just not having the conveniences that we all depend on right now, but very cold as well in Ukraine. One of the things I was listening to our interview from last year, and one of the things you were talking about is that you were glad that your son Martin hadn't experienced the air raids and the threat of bombs falling, that you were glad that you were able to protect him from that. How has he reacted to being back in the city? How's that been for you as a mother to explain to him life with the air raids going off?
Yes, indeed. That is something that, as a mother, anyone listening to this would understand. That is something you don't want to explain to your child. You don't want to explain him or her that the air raid alert means that there can be bomb coming your way. That is very scary reality. And I'll tell you this, the first night when he arrived from the west of Ukraine to my parents' place, which is 50 kilometers away from Kiev, at that time, my parents' place, it was damaged because of the warfare around. The village was not under occupation, but there was still military activity around the village. So I think half of the windows at my parents' place were broken. So we had to change them. And then there were some other visible signs of military activity taking place that my son couldn't not see, right? Like the holes in the fence around the house of my parents. So he could clearly see the difference compared to where he has been in the west of Ukraine for 4 or 5 months before that. The first night that he arrives to my parents' place, he goes to sleep in his room, and then 15 minutes after that, he comes to my room and he says, "Mom, I can't sleep." And I say, "Sweetie, what happened?" And he says, "Will Russians come overnight and kill me?" And that was something that because you understand, as a mother, you cannot fall apart even if you want to, because you have to be strong. But that was the moment when I could feel that I want to cry, but I can't, because I have responsibility to keep him, make sure that he feels as safe as possible. So I explained to him that I wouldn't have brought him there unless I was sure that he's safe there, and we had to make a little conversation and so on and so forth. But I'll tell you this: over a half a year that he's been here in Kiev, he's not sleeping very well. So he's 11 years old. So he's no, he's 10. He's turning 11. He's 10 and a half. So his kids of his age are supposed to sleep overnight in their beds, and they should be fine. But he quite often, yeah, that's him over the summer, I guess. He would come over to my bed and say, "I'm scared. I want to sleep with you." That's something that he didn't do before the big scale invasion, right? So he would sleep all night in his bed and there wouldn't be any problem with that. But then now he does have problems sleeping. And also the air raid alerts is something that he, of course, experiences here in Kiev quite a lot. And when he's at school, he goes to the bomb shelter. There were several occasions when we got to the bomb shelter when we were together. One was during one of the big attacks in Kiev, when I could literally hear explosions. Then I grabbed him and I told him we're going to the metro station, and it was all crowded. And at first he was fine. Then he got very scared and he told me, "Mom, am I going to die?" And I was like, "Oh my God, calm down, Ina, calm down." I kneeled near him and I said, "It's going to be fine. We are just going to grab some stuff and go to the metro station. It's really close. We're going to be fine." And then he calmed down. And then on our way to the metro station, we are running there. And he suddenly stops and he says, "Mommy, are those regular bombs or nuclear bombs?" And I got stuck in that moment, and I didn't know what to respond. And he clearly saw my confusion. And I told him the sentence which I never believed I would pronounce. I said, "Sweetie, don't worry, those are just regular bombs." And he said, "Oh, okay. But just in case, so that you know, I know what to do in case those are nuclear bombs, because that is what we learned at school." So at that point, he was not a scared kid anymore. That moment was gone. He was quite calm. He just was a 10-year-old who wanted to tell his mom that there is something he learned at school and he wanted to share this knowledge. Now, but this is some sort of knowledge that you don't want your kid to have. That is not something that you want him to experience. And I believe that every single parent listening to this will understand how painful this is.
Did you ever have a moment where you weren't sure that you felt that your life was very much threatened?
I think after April, not so much. I think, well, of course, when Russians were near Kiev and that was all very close, that is when you could feel danger. You would be walking on the streets of Kiev, which was empty in March, and mostly in April, it was very empty and it just felt wrong. Just imagine a city you are living in, suddenly there are no people on the streets. There are some random cars, some random few people, but that's it. That just creeps you out, you know. But I think after May, being in Kiev does not feel unsafe. Maybe apart from two big air raid attacks when they were targeting energy infrastructure. And again, you think that, well, if they're targeting energy infrastructure and I'm not near one, I should be more or less safe. So you kind of understand that the probability is very low. So, but on the other hand, you don't want to overreact, but you don't want to underestimate the danger either, because you remember, I think, one of the moments when we were probably most shocked over the winter was when a Russian bomb hit a residential building in Dnipro city, destroying a 9th-floor building with about 50 people killed in that attack. And I think that is when everybody felt that you are never safe, because that house that they bombed, that looks just like very regular, typical house in Ukraine. It looks a bit different from the one that I live in, but it doesn't matter. This is the type of house that everybody recognizes. And then when you see that this happens to a house that you could have been living in, that is what hit us. That is when we all felt, that was the moment when we all felt that even if you're far from energy infrastructure, it can be just a random hit, like it happened to those poor people in Dnipro.
I have something to show you. This was the photograph that you posted last year that one of our audience members saw and flagged for me. And this is how we met. Is I said, well, I need to reach out to this member of parliament. And for those that are listening, Ina is sitting on the ground on her computer next to a gun, next to a rifle. And the caption, I'm just sort of summarizing here, was that you were going to continue to do your work, but that you were ready to fight. And I just have to ask, do you still have that gun?
So I don't, because I gave it to my dad, because I don't know how to use guns, and I don't want to use guns, and I think that I'm much more helpful in doing other things. We were given guns, and I think at that time it was probably the only thing that could have been done, because there was lots of information that members of parliament would be the targets in case Russians try to take over the city and so on and so forth. So just as a matter of individual protection, that was a way to do so by the government. But now it's actually at my parents' place, because I figured that after all, my dad would be a better owner for that.
We had sort of a funny exchange about that, because you had mentioned that your boyfriend, who is currently actively serving, has repeatedly said to you, oh, let's go and I'll teach you how to use a gun, before this happened. And then you always said, no, that's not something that you wanted to do, which I related to, because my husband's former military and he does the same thing, but you don't think about yourself in a scenario where someone hands you a weapon and says, this is for your safety and protection. This is the stakes right now. And so that image, I mean, will forever be an image that I'll remember. And I'm sure is a time that you remember. When you look back on that photograph, what do you think? What goes through your mind? What do you wish you could tell her, that version of yourself a year ago?
Well, that's a good question. I think what would have been probably most important for me at that point to know is that I have to brace myself for a longer fight. Because I think at this picture, the woman who sits there still has some very slight, but still hopes that maybe it will be done, it will be over soon. But I think by April, we all figured out that it can take so much longer, and we should just prepare ourselves for much longer fight. So I should, pace myself. I should think about how to use my time correctly, and I think that is the most important mental change that we all experienced.
Well, we don't know the future. We never do. We wish we could at certain points. What do you think the future holds at this moment from where you're sitting about what's the next chapter in this war?
Um, no, I just thought of another thing that I wish I knew at that time when I was sitting on that
Please
picture.
tell us.
I wish at that point I knew that Ukrainian army would be able to win against Russians, because at the time when this picture was taken, we were still unsure. I mean, everybody were amazed with how brave Ukrainians have been, but everybody were like, yeah, they're extremely brave, they're immensely, courageous, and so on and so forth. But this the second biggest army in the world. There is no way they would be able to stand against it. But since that time, what has happened is Ukrainian army kicked Russians out from around Kiev. Look, Russian army has been literally 20 minutes drive from where I am right now. So that was really, really very, very close. I could see the fire in Irpin and Bucha from my windows when I got back home end of March last year. So it was very, very close. They're not here anymore. We have kicked them out from Kharkiv region. We have kicked them out from Kherson. I didn't know at that time when that picture was taken that this would have been possible. I had hope, but of course, not knowing was something that was killing you. That was something that kept you awake at night, something that you were always worried about. Like, you don't know what is going to happen, and the variability of what could happen is huge. I mean, we never know what is going to happen, but probably for most of our listeners, the variability of what could potentially happen is a bit smaller than for us in March 2022, right? Because so I think that this is something that I wish I knew at that time. I probably would have slept a little bit better compared to what I did. But I think that what we have learned over this year is that Russian army is big, but it's not as scary as the world thought it would be. And the Ukrainian army is smaller, but morale and commitment play a great deal in victory. And that is something that we have, we definitely have advantage compared to the Russian army, which is often disoriented and they just don't know what they're fighting for. And that is why they can't win, because they don't understand what they're fighting for.
How big is the Ukrainian military? How many people are currently serving in it?
So as of right now, there are almost 1 million people who are serving in the Ukrainian army. So that really depends on whom you calculate, like people securing the border. Are they in those numbers or out of those numbers? People working in security services, people working in police. Police is not the army, but if you talk about policemen who are in the villages and towns on the battlefront, they are doing the same as the military people are doing. So it doesn't really matter which sort of uniform they're wearing. So the numbers are a bit different, but it's still about 1 million people. So that's huge. That's a very big number.
And what is the estimate for the Russian military, whatever estimates that you are using in your work? I know you've talked really around the world about what Ukraine is currently facing, but that's been a big question about how many Russian soldiers are in Ukraine, how big is their military in general? And then I'm going to ask you a little bit about these other quote unquote private military companies that we've covered a little bit at SmartHER News. But what is the number that you operate with thinking about what the Ukrainian military is facing?
So we don't have the specific number because it's very difficult to calculate. But what we know for sure is that the number of Russians who are on Ukrainian territory is smaller than the number of Ukrainians who are actively serving in one capacity or another. So yes, Russian army overall is much bigger than Ukrainian, but we have mobilized lots of people and we have increased our army. Our army was about 250,000 people last February, and now it's almost 4 times bigger. If you depends on how you calculate, but that's roughly a rough estimate. So you remember when this big invasion was starting, people were talking about 300 Russians who are at the border. right? So even if they mobilized about 300,000 more, but they have also had losses, and their losses
Mhm.
are about 100,000 people, both killed and wounded. So it's 500,000 people. That it would be a very rough estimation. So again, nobody would be able to tell you the exact number, but we know it's a smaller number. But remember that we have to keep many of our soldiers, for instance, on the north of the country. So there is no active military action there, but we keep them there just to make sure that there is no military action there, right? So that is why we need more people to protect what we already have and to ensure that they actually don't attack from north, for instance.
And that's just what my curiosity in covering this story has been about what is the concern about manpower? Because the United States and others can provide aid, but is there a real burning concern within the Ukrainian government? And I'm going to ask you to kind of put on your hat there as a member of the government. Is there a concern about running out of manpower, of not, and the sustaining amount of energy that those that serve, including your boyfriend, who has been serving for now more than a year, how much they can endure? What is the concern about just simply manpower?
Uh, so, truth be told, of course, it's very challenging, right? So my boyfriend Sasha, he's been at the battlefront since February 24th. He would come over to Kiev from time to time, but I think within the last 12 months, he spent 3 weeks in Kiev, maybe 4 weeks in Kiev during the whole period. The rest of the time he's somewhere there. But adds to that the fact that his children from his first marriage are actually abroad, so he hasn't seen his kids for over a year. And I'm telling this is just one example of one person, but that is the case for thousands of other Ukrainian soldiers who are actively fighting. So yes, they are fighting. They are not giving up. They're not planning to give up, but it is getting emotionally exhausting for them. That is why right now the government, the Ministry of Defense, are talking about some sort of rotation mechanism where we would have to train new people so that the people who have already spent at least 1 year in the battlefront, and then there are other people who have been serving since 2014, since the Russia the attacked Donbas region specifically, so that they would be able to be dismissed for a short period of time or maybe longer period of time, but other people would take over, right? So this is a challenge, of course, but I'll tell you the truth that at the moment there is no problems with the manpower. The problem is not so much with the manpower; it's having enough ammunition is the issue, and I think that is important to understand. So we can mobilize people, but you can mobilize people responsibly if you can provide them with the weapons, and not just with the guns, with the rifles and so on. In this type of warfare that we're in, they need tanks, they need artillery, they need ammunition, they need air defense, so on and so forth. So that is what they need. So the number of people is not the biggest concern. Making sure that they have what it takes to actually win against Russians, that is a big concern. But the good part of this news is that the situation is similar for Russians. Of course, Russia is much bigger than us, right? It has much more people. Theoretically, it can mobilize much more people. But they are facing problems with ammunition as well. Again, they have been initially much bigger, so they had much bigger stocks, but they're kind of running out of what they had, but we are gaining compared to what we had. So for us, the dynamics in terms of what we have for our army is positive, but for them is negative. So they still have more than we do, but the dynamics is kind of gives me hope. Let's put it this way.
Are you concerned about the reports about China providing lethal aid to Russia because of the scenario that you just described?
Yeah, exactly. Because what it gives us hope is that Russians will, with the sanctions, they wouldn't have access to multiple technologies, and they wouldn't be able to kind of reproduce what they already had, right? And that would be good, because then at some point they will run out of their own ammunition, of their own tanks, and then they would have to give up finally. But Ukraine is luckily still having support, increasing support from the US, from European Union. So the track is good. I mean, it could have been faster. That's another discussion. But the dynamic is overall positive. But this indeed can change if China decides to give weapons, to supply weapons and ammunition to Russia. And that is why right now all diplomatic efforts are encouraged to make sure that China doesn't do that. I think it's crucially important because this would be, I wouldn't say a final deciding factor in this war, but it would be a very significant factor that would change the dynamics that is more positive than negative at this point of time.
That's really helpful. I'll never forget you telling me that your father was traveling from Western Ukraine back to your area around Kiev, back to where his home is, and that he had decided, and he had told you and your mother, who's visiting, by the way, we may hear a little bit in the background, that he was going to join the territorial defense. He was in his 60s. He had prior military experience and just said, wife, daughter, this is what I'm doing. So for people to get, I think that really brings home when you say that there's a will to fight and there are resources. I imagine people like your father who are really willing to step up. So is your father still serving? Did he serve in the territorial defense? What was that like?
So what he was doing was when the Ukrainian army was stationed in their village, he was helping them in any way possible. I mean, after all, he was 61 at the time, so him actively serving was difficult, but he was still there. He was available. He was making food for the soldiers, which is also a very important thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
So he stayed there. He made sure that the soldiers who were stationed in his village, which was not under occupation, but it was like village away from them, Russians occupied the territory. So it was really, really close. And actually, the village of my parents was heavily shelled by the Russians because that was the village where Ukrainian army was stationed. So it was important for him to be there. But for the time being, Kiev is not under any threat. So he's back to his regular work. So he's there. Just working as a guard in.
Back to work. Well, he sounds like he probably doesn't sit still very well based on on your description of him, that he seems like he's a very active guy and willing to help out in a myriad of different ways. What is it like just to get basic supplies, Ina? Like going to the grocery store? Are you able, I'm just curious what daily life is like for you. Are you able to go to restaurants? Are you able to get things out of the grocery store? You know, the basics of sending things around the country. What is that like for you?
So it has changed over the last year. So I remember when I was here in April, I would go to my supermarket and I remember I started crying for a very stupid reason in the supermarket. When I came to the supermarket, it was April, it was nice sunny weather. Kiev was almost empty. And I go to a supermarket, which is the typical supermarket I go to, which typically has, 30 types of bread, 30 types, and you can choose from whatever you want. And then I get into the supermarket and there is one type of bread. And I look at that and I start crying. I mean, that sounds ridiculous right now, but that is how I felt. I felt it makes you feel the extent to which your life has changed because of this. I mean, it's stupid. You can still survive with one type of bread, but this is not what you choose for yourself, right? You are building your life. You are working, you are doing something with your life, you're planning something, you're making choices, and then suddenly none of that matters because there is only one type of bread in the supermarket, but because there are no supplies. But the situation started changing quite rapidly over the summer. So over the summer, many people would come back to the city. The city became crowded again, particularly in September when the school year started. Many families who have kids, they cut back because they wanted their kids to go to school offline instead of continuing online for fourth year in a row. So that was when things started changing. And I think for me, the most when I realized that everything is more or less back to normal in terms of everyday life was when my favorite type of Italian ice cream got back to the supermarket. And I think that was around November. So that was the moment when I realized that, supply chains have really got back to normal, because apparently for a time being, they were disrupted very severely. And then when I got my favorite ice cream back in the supermarket, I realized that, things are more or less back to normal. But the unpleasant thing is that inflation is very big. So it's so theoretically, yes, is there my favorite ice cream? Yes, but it's also is very expensive. So I think inflation is about 25%. So, but that really depends on the type of product, because car fuel is almost twice more expensive compared to what it used to be.
So are your friends able to live in Kiev? I mean, obviously you're there, you have a government, you're in the government, you're an active member of government. Your presence is necessary and important in Kiev. But for your friends that were working in different industries, have they all left? Have they stayed? Are they getting paid still through their employer? What
No,
has that done to the city?
so as of right now, Kiev is pretty much back to its normal size in terms of people. It's not necessarily the same people, because there are some people who left. For instance, I do have some friends who have small kids. I have a good friend of mine who just had a baby. She learned that she was pregnant a week before the full-scale invasion. So 1 week before that. So she had a baby in uh, end of September or early, no, I think early August. So she had a very small baby, and then with those power cuts, she just left for the winter time because she couldn't function when there is no electricity and you have to go up and down with a stroller. That's just not doable with a small baby. So there are people who left because of that, but then there are other people, for instance, from Kharkiv, who moved from Kharkiv and they moved to Kiev. So people have changed, but the total number of people living in Kiev, 3.5 million, is pretty much the same as it was before the full-scale invasion. So people can do this. People can afford it, but people not necessarily afford the same things as they used to before.
How concerned are you then? Obviously, I don't feel like we need to state the obvious, but obviously, no one wants to live in a country at war. We want peace. We want everyone to live in a land of peace. But because what you're describing is somewhat sustainable, that you're able to have some of the basics that you need, you're able to live, and your child's able to go to school. Are you concerned that that sustainable status quo will only add to this war lingering? Because for a certain part of the country, it's extremely intense fighting on the eastern part. But then for the rest of the country, it's a little bit different reality. How do you navigate that?
Oh, that's something that is of great concern to me, because you are very right in saying that different people experience this war differently, and even people in Kiev. Because I'll tell you this, as we have been talking, my boyfriend is with the army, so for me, war is everyday reality. So I wake up every morning and I text him to check that he is okay, because for me that is something that, and I actually, when I realized that, when he came to Kiev in January and he stayed for 2 or 3 weeks, that was the first time he stayed in Kiev for such a prolonged period of time. And I think by the end of the second week, I realized that news about war are kind of a bit more distant from me, because I don't have to worry about him every second of my life. And then I realized that actually, okay, yes, there are 1 million people who are serving. Not all of them are on the direct battlefront, but let's say 500,000 of people are actively serving, and there are family members of those people who are actively serving. For them, war is everyday reality. But then there are people who are not necessarily touched directly by war, right? It depends, regardless of which part of Ukraine they live in. But if their loved ones are not serving, if they're not serving themselves, they already experience this war differently, right? But then also there are people who, we are today recording this video, and yesterday we had a terrible news about one of Ukrainian most famous soldiers. Dmitro, his call sign was Da Vinci because he used to draw. Kutsubaila, who was killed in near Bakhmut. And that was a shocking news for all of us. And that is something that, again, thousands of Ukrainian families experienced, while others' families can more or less live their more or less normal life. I mean, with air raid alerts and all of that, but it's nothing compared to what the experience for the families who lost their loved ones is, right? So that is, I mean, we can't fix it, that there is nothing we can do about it, but probably recognize this experience is different for different people, and we would have to talk about it. I think the only way to kind of to close this gap between understanding of the war of different people is just by talking to each other and telling each other what your experience of the war is, you know. But you are right in saying that this war has felt very different for very different people. We are still very united. So still every time there is a big attack, or like yesterday's piece of news about Da Vinci's killing, that is when everybody stays strong and stays united, and people continue to donate to help the army and so on and so forth. But yeah, experience is very different.
I'm going to pull up the map one more time because I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the key things that could be considered variables to ending the war sooner. And so if we look in the east, although Bakhmut is not marked here, the eastern part of Ukraine has been at war with, and I should say the Russians invaded the eastern part of Ukraine in 2014. There's been war in that particular part of the country for many, many years. There's a current battle around a smaller city called Bakhmut that's getting a lot of attention around the world that you just mentioned. When I say the words Wagner Group, what comes to mind, Ina?
So Wagner Group is a private military company that was started by a guy named Prigozhin, who is very close to Putin. They have been active, so everybody know them because of Bakhmut today. But they have actually been established way before, and they have not only been active in Ukraine, they've been active in other parts of the world globally where Russia wanted to have some military presence. So you should know that it's not just Ukraine that they're at war with. They have been active in other military zones as well. But of course, they became most known and most recognized for this, So first, they were a group of better trained military. Those who typically served in the military, they left their position and they joined the private contractor because it's, for multiple reasons. Maybe the payment is better there, or less bureaucracy, or whatever. But I think by end of autumn last year, they were not an elite military group anymore. They actually started recruiting people who were in jail. They started recruiting basically anybody. So they are special now, not because they are highly trained and highly professional, but basically because they don't follow any basic rules and procedures of any basic laws of war. They're just a private contractor who takes in anybody they've been allowed to take in people who are incarcerated. Do I pronounce it correctly?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Then apparently there was some fight between the leader of this group, Prigozhin, and the Ministry of Defense of Russia. So they were not allowed to recruit among in jails anymore. So most recent piece of information we got was that they were most likely recruiting in hospitals for people with mental illnesses. But the thing is, why they recruit this type of people is because they need them as a sheer human shield. They don't care about those people at all. So what I'm hearing from people who were around Bakhmut is that, and this is true, again, this is very direct eyewitnesses to that the first group of people who go, those are gonna die like 90%. And the military commanders there, they basically recognize it. They say, if you don't go there, we're going to shoot you. You can try and go there. Maybe you will survive. Again, what our military are saying is that very often this first, I call it not a group, but kind of first
wave,
round,
a first wave of
yeah. first wave of people that very often they don't even have rifles because they don't need to, because they are there for Ukrainian army to shoot them down. Why other waves need that? So that they will know where Ukrainians are stationed. So this sounds terrifying from normal human perspective, but that is the strategies that Wagner Group is employing. So it's anybody who is for some reason not important for the leadership of the group. They go in this first wave. 90% chances that they will be killed. Nobody cares about that, and this is how this group functions. But the thing is that despite this terrifying tactics, they still, after 4 months of trying very intensely, they still didn't capture Bakhmut. So that speaks to efficiency of this tactic.
Well, and it also highlights to us the darkness of war, of what the Russian tactics are, and also kind of wraps us back around to the beginning of our conversation when you were talking about the need for ammunition and how much the ammunition is important. Because if you think about what the Ukrainian military is dealing with, all of that takes time and resources and energy and tools. If the other side is just pushing people out there just to dispense of them, as a part of a strategy. I'm going to finish up here quick. I know we're short on time, Ina. I wanted to just get your thoughts on something. I've seen that you've been speaking around Europe on this particular topic, and I wanted to ask you about it. The United States obviously has given a lot of aid. The count that is most often reported is more than $100 billion. Some of that is direct cash and aid. Some of it is different in equipment. There is concern here at home about how much it's going to take us to backfill some of the equipment that we have pushed to the Ukrainians. And this is all part of the debate here at home about what does future American support look like. In the meantime, though, the isolation of the Russian economy and making sure that Russia is not an active participant of the global economy because they're using that money to flush into their battle into Ukraine is a big topic. And I've noticed that you've been talking, whether it's to the British government, to German companies that have been saying that you're trying to get the message out. Hey, for lack of it, I'm just going to speak casually. Hey, you guys are still doing business with Russia. You're still fueling their economy. Talk to me about that. What is actually happening in Europe? What should we know about? And how, to what level is this still occurring?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for this question, because indeed that is something of strategic importance and something where we need to inform the debate and to explain what is actually happening. So point number one I want to make is that, yes, we understand that the West altogether is spending lots of money on helping Ukraine. However, as a percentage of GDP, the numbers are not actually that big. But what is even more important is that
you're saying of their GDP. Of each country's GDP.
Yeah. Yes, okay. Of course. Because for us right now, like half of our public spending comes from loans and grants from other countries, which we appreciate a lot. But when we speak about US GDP or EU GDP, the percentage of money that actually goes to war is less than 1%. So that is actually, given the level of challenge that it helps to prevent, helps to deal with, that's probably not that big percentage of money spent. But what is even more important, and I think that is particularly important for the American audience to hear, is that this money is being spent very well because it actually produces results. It's not like giving money to some country for weapons and not getting any results. I think the historical, associations here are pretty obvious. But this is actually where giving more money and weapons to Ukrainians is actually producing results, because we have actually, again, kicked Russians from around Kiev, Kharkiv region, Kherson, and so on and so forth. So here we can see how this help actually delivers. And I think that
and just to pause you there, because I think that is important to talk about investment and seeing returns on investment. And that's what we're using sterile terms, but that's what you're talking about. If that US aid went away tomorrow, what would happen? What would happen to the Ukrainian government? What would happen to the Ukrainian military?
So in terms of military, we would be able to support our military. Pay them salaries and so on and so forth. But of course, we wouldn't have access to new weapons. So that would basically at least freeze the battlefront. That is the best case scenario. So that is something to be aware of, is that if help stops coming, That would at least freeze the front line. Worst case scenario, it would allow Russians to progress and take over more villages and cities, most likely on the east and south of the country, with terrifying human results, of course, because we know what they're doing on the territories that they have occupied. So yeah, an important argument to the American audience is that we highly appreciate what you are helping us with, and we are, trust me, doing everything we can to make sure that we use the resources as wisely as humanly possible at all. And I think that now Ukrainian army has actually proven that it's very skillful and very professional, and given money to Ukrainian army actually yields results, which I think is critically important. But of course, it would be much easier for us if we didn't have to, kind of try to catch up with Russian big military force. But if Russian military force actually shrank, became smaller, and the way to do that is by stopping investing in Russian economy. Because if we look at 2022, the annual summary, the sad fact is that Russians actually gained more, 28% more, from selling energy sources to the world compared to 2021. So that was because of the sanctions, which were introduced a bit too late, because of the increased prices on gas on the international markets, and so on and so forth. So there were multiple reasons why it happened, but then also because some companies still continue to work in Russia, and that is unfortunate, but that is the case, right? And they continue to work, and this creates double result. A, they continue to pay taxes that help fund the military action of Russian government. But also, two, no less important, is they kind of create the sense of normality for regular Russians. So there is no internal pressure inside Russia to actually protest against this, because they don't see big changes for their individual well-being if they can still have access to majority of the Western goods that they're used to. You see, because if suddenly they lost access to that, that would actually create some disturbances in their lives, and they might actually question to what extent is that worth it. But if Western companies continue to do business in Russia, then of course the regular Russians feel like, my life is more or less fine. And then also we are kicking their asses, and we are so proud of our soldiers taking over, Ukrainian villages and restoring the great power of Russian Empire, and so on and so forth.
So what stops that? First of all, what's the reaction when you talk to members of the British government and you say, hey, this is still going on? Or you talk to members in the German economy that are, executives at German companies, and you say, hey guys, can we cut this out? What is their reaction, and what actually would stop it?
So reaction differs, of course, depending on if you speak to people from the government or opposition, from different types of political groups, and so on and so forth. I think majority recognizes that the West cannot at the same time be supporting Ukrainian army and Russian economy, because it's schizophrenic. It doesn't make sense, right? But also people recognize that it can be very difficult. How do we make sure that our companies actually withdraw from Russia? What about poor Russians who will get, lose access to some goods? And so on and so forth. This argument is actually pretty ridiculous, because unless they feel direct effect on their lifestyles, they would not protest against this war. So I think that this should actually be the goal, is to make sure that they lose access to some of the goods that they got used to. But I think for many people, the economic argument is also important. Like, if we stop doing business in Russia, our economy will suffer. So we have to continue doing that, because otherwise our people will face inflation and so on and so forth, which is, from the political standpoint, understandable. All politicians in Europe, not in Russia, in Europe, have to face elections, so they have to, to stay popular. But I think the question is also that of kind of educating the public and explaining that sometimes there are bigger things at stake. And if NATO recognizes, and it's official now, that Russia is its biggest enemy, then it's a military situation. It's not the same situation that was in 2010, where economy could be the driver of the decision-making process. No, we are talking about existential change, existential challenge to the existence of my country, but also of European countries. Because if Ukraine lost, a Russian army would go further. So that is existential threat we are talking about. And I often feel that there probably is not enough political courage on the side of the European leaders to acknowledge it, which is unfortunate.
Well, political courage and election cycles are things we talk a lot about on Smarter News because they are reoccurring themes in a multitude of different stories. I'm so glad you pointed out, though, that the Russian government isn't facing exactly the same thing, because that's what life is like under an authoritarian regime, like that in Russia, like that in China. And so that maps out some of what are the different calculations and risk level that people are willing to take to stay in power. I know Martin is home from school, either shortly home from school or coming home from school, and you've been so gracious, with your time. I just have a final question for you. At this point, what does winning look like in Ukraine?
But yes, Martin is back from school. He's sitting over there.
He's the quietest, most well-behaved 10-year-old I've ever had in an interview. If he'd like to say hello, he always can.
Yeah, he can. Yeah, oh, yes, he wants to.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
Yeah. So, sweetie, do you want to say hello?
Hello, Jenna.
Hi, Martin. How are you?
Nice.
Let me. You're good. Martin, do you remember your time in California, living in California?
Kind of.
Kind of. What did you do at school today?
Wait, can I sit down somewhere?
Yes.
This is kind of
good. I agree. It's really important in an interview that your subject is comfortable. So I think that's important. Martin, thank you. So what did you study in school today?
We revised what factors are. Factors are that factors are you multiply that number to get that number.
Oh, I see. So multiplication, would that be something that you're working on?
Yeah.
And fractions? Yeah. I was never very good at that, Martin. Are you good at math?
Well, I'm good at multiplication, but not at division.
At division. I think that comes with time. Multiplication, division, fractions. Yeah. I've been talking to your mom about what's going on in your country. What do you think of your mom's work? What do you think of what your mom does every day?
I forgot what her job is.
Yeah, but what do you think?
That sounds exactly like my kids, Martin.
I vote. Yeah, I vote. Okay, he knows that I vote.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, what kind of mom is your mom like? Tell us about her. What is she like?
Well, I don't know what to say.
Am I good mom?
Yes, you are.
Wonderful, fun, hilarious. I heard, so this is one thing that your mom told me. We talked about a year ago, and your mom told me that no matter what was happening in the world, that she always made sure that you did your math homework. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah. And also that you have the music, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I heard you got a piano recently. Is that true?
Yeah, that is. It's right under the stairs.
Wonderful. And how is that going?
Well, it's going good. I can play the Wednesday song.
I'm so proud. I don't know how to play anything on the piano, so that's amazing. Would you like to? I'm your mom. I promise. I asked her one last question, but would you like to say anything to? So I have kids. My children are a little bit younger than you. They're 8, 6, and 3. The 3-year-old is a little bit of a maniac, Martin. If you met him, he's a lot.
What does maniac even mean?
Oh, it means he's that's a great question. He's full of energy and he doesn't listen and he rarely wears any clothes. So he's just wild. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. So, but I would think they would be very curious about what life is like in Ukraine and what it's like to be a kid in Ukraine right now. What would you like to tell them about what it's like to be a kid in Ukraine?
I don't know what to say about that.
What is the
Okay.
difference?
In America and the Ukraine?
Yeah,
Well, sure. Yeah.
like you can tell about air raid alerts.
Air raid alerts, those, because there's none in America and there are some here in Ukraine. Oh, and I want to ask you something, Mom.
And what do you do when there is an air raid alert?
Go to the shelter.
To the shelter. And
Is it
does that-
scary?
No.
No, not that often now.
That's good.
Okay, we'll
Bye, hey, Martin, I look forward. You want to come to Texas anytime? We have cowboy boots here, real life cowboys. Have you been to Texas before?
No, never.
Okay, I think you should come. We'll go to a rodeo. Oh, yes.
Коли у мене буде заняття?
in 50 minutes.
50.
Yes.
Oh, so it won't be... Це буде в 7?
Так. Точно. Okay. We
Thank you for that appearance. No, I love Martin. Martin can come on anytime. It's great. I'd love to hear the piano, all of that. And he is welcome to Texas.
This class, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. I know you have to get back to doing all the things that you're doing.
Yeah, but I
let's
should
just speak up there.
answer the question about
Yeah.
victory looks like. And it still looks the same as it did a year ago. So it's still the same because we need to take back control of our territory. And there shouldn't be any Russian soldier on Ukrainian territory. Some people can say, well, it's idealistic. Well, I say it's pragmatic because until there is a single Russian soldier on Ukrainian soil, there is always a danger that thousands more will come. People are debating, well, what about Crimea? Well, I'll tell you this. Until we control Crimea fully, this will always be a danger to us because what Russians did in 8 years of annexation, they militarized it. And that is how they actually got to the south of Ukraine because they had so many tanks stationed in Crimea. So it's if we forget all the international law and spirit arguments, it's a mere fact of it's a very pragmatic approach. We need to make sure that this war ends once and for all. You've seen my son there. If there is another war in 8 years, he's going to be 18 and he will be drafted into the army. That is what I, as any mother, don't want to happen. So we need this war to end once and forever. And the only way to do this is to make sure that there is no single Russian soldier on Ukrainian territory, which is recognized by international community.
That's very helpful, Ina. Thank you. And that perspective on time. You think 8 years is so long from, long time from now, 10 years. I think about that for my son all the time as well. What sort of world will they be coming into fully as an adult? And that really brings it home. Ina, thanks for inviting us into your home and spending all this time. It was wonderful to see you again. I look forward to staying in touch and thank you for providing such invaluable perspective to all of us at SmartHER News.
Yeah, thank you for covering this and for your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ina. Well, that was a wide-ranging interview. We went a lot of different places, and it gives me a lot to think about, certainly. Very much appreciate Ina, and you can follow her on social media, on Twitter, on Instagram. I'll make sure that those are posted within the description of this interview so that you can follow along with the work that she's doing with her family. And that is a way for us all to stay connected, where it's not just a sterile headline coming from a far-off place in the world. It's an important story to a family that we now know, and we'll continue to cover it in that way as well. Thank you so much for your support of SmartHER News. Quick, concise, nonpartisan information, always more on our website, smarternews.com. And I'll see you back here with more soon. Have a great day.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, SmartHER News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing SmartHER.